Hello, and welcome back to our channel. My name is Harman Chabla. I'm a pediatric ICU physician, and today we'll be discussing ventilator management, and more specifically, the metrics that we look at for pressure control versus volume control ventilation. Now, this is the outline of our presentation for today. We're going to start by discussing the Puritan-Bennett screen, where we'll go over the basics of pressure control, the basics of volume control, and then essentially the basics of bedside monitoring based off the different type of mode that you're in. All right, so now when we start looking at the Puritan-Bennett screen, the fastest way to realize what mode you're on is actually by looking at the bottom left corner of the ventilator screen. So if we look here in the bottom left corner, it says SIMV PC, indicating that this patient here is in a pressure control mode. And alternatively, if we're in a VC mode, it'll look like this, where it'll say VC again in the bottom left corner. We'll kind of go over the screen one more time real quick. P-peak, again, reflects the peak pressure that the patient is on. VTE stands for the exhaled tidal volume that the patient is actually receiving. Now, there is one difference that I do want to point out, and that's with regards to inspiratory time. On a pressure control mode, you have the ability to set the inspiratory time directly by just saying, I want the patient to breathe in for 0.55 seconds, as in this case. But when you're in a volume control mode, you actually have to select a Vmax, and that Vmax basically will set what the I time will be. As you go into the setting, there's a little slider bar at the bottom which tells you what the inspiratory time winds up being for a given Vmax. Aside from that, the rest of the settings on the screens are consistent with what we had gone over in the previous video. So now we'll just go over the pressure control basics. The ventilator on pressure control mode delivers a pressure that's selected by the provider, and that's to say that the pressure that's selected is above PEEP. This pressure is demarcated as the delta P and is found at the bottom of the screen as an inspiratory pressure. Based off how compliant or diseased the patient's lungs are, a return volume is recorded, and it's something that kind of reflects the patient's state. So that tidal volume coming back to you is that VTE that we looked at the top of the screen on the screen previous. In addition, it's also important to note that a patient that's breathing spontaneously, that has no paralysis on board or is breathing above the ventilator, will get the benefit of pressure supported breaths, which are also selected. And those pressure supported breaths are, again, pressure support that gets dialed in. Now, these are the various waveforms that a patient on pressure control mode goes through. There are certain things that we do want to point out here. And when we're in a pressure control mode, the peak pressure is selected, and the ventilator will hold that peak pressure for a given amount of time, the inspiratory time, and you'll note that the pressure actually flattens out along the top. The other thing to kind of keep in mind is how that pressure is delivered. So as you can see, when you look at the flow going in through the breath, there's a very quick ramp up of the flow, and then afterwards it winds up decelerating through the course of the breath. So that initial high flow rate and then the decelerating ramp flow pattern is very characteristic of what a pressure control breath is. So since we are selecting a peak pressure, and the patient's disease process or the patient's lungs will tell us how much tidal volume is returned. So if you take a look, tidal volumes can actually be variable on a pressure control mode of ventilation. Now, when we start getting into volume control, it does change a little bit. In a volume control mode of ventilation, the tidal volume is what's selected, and based off the patient's lung disease or lung process, the peak pressure is what's variable. So someone that has extremely stiff lungs is going to have a higher peak pressure than someone that has relatively compliant lungs. And that peak pressure, again, if you'll recall, is written up at that top banner of the screen. And in this instance, the peak pressure is 16, albeit this is on a spontaneous breath. Now, we'll go over the different flows that occur on volume control breaths, but it's also important to note that if the patient is breathing spontaneously above the set ventilator rate, a pressure support breath is given under the parameters of what basically a pressure control breath would be, with the exception of an I time. So on a pressure supported breath, it's important to note that the I time is set by the patient and not the ventilator. So that I time parameter does not apply on pressure support breaths. So So now we'll actually look at the different loops that are associated with a volume control mode of ventilation. And the first one we'll actually draw attention to is what the targeted volumes are. So you'll see here, each breath very consistently delivers 500 milliliters of tidal volume. Now, this was variable that in the pressure control mode where we were getting different tidal volume returns. What we actually monitor on a volume control mode is the peak pressure that comes back. So you'll see some peak pressures may be lower than others on a volume control mode of ventilation. And the other thing too is how that breath is delivered. So if we actually look at the flow pattern, you'll remember that on pressure control mode, the flow actually went up very quickly at the beginning and then came down slowly. That was called a decelerating flow pattern. On volume control mode, you'll notice that there's a very stable flow pattern that occurs here. And so this is known as the square waveform, and the square waveform is characteristic for volume control modes of ventilation. So we'll just quickly go over what the actual differences in bedside monitoring needs to be. So we'll start by looking at the pressure control mode of ventilation first. And remember, on pressure control modes of ventilation, the return tidal volume is what's variable, and so that's what needs to be monitored very closely. As a bedside practitioner, it's very important to know that if a patient's condition is worsening, that they might have lower return tidal volumes, and it may require interventions, earlier interventions than previous. So it's important to not wait for the alarms to go off to say, hey, we have low tidal volumes. It's important to kind of keep that mental note of what the tidal volumes are and follow them through time. Now, since we select the delta P or the inspiratory pressure, the peak pressure that comes back is fixed. The PEEP is something that's fixed. And again, similarly, the pressure supported breaths are the ones that do not have an inspiratory time, and so they may have a different tidal volume associated with them. When we look at the volume control mode of ventilation, it's important to note that the tidal volume is what's fixed there, as in you dial in the tidal volume that you want coming back. And as a result, the peak pressure that you wind up getting is what's variable. Now, again, this is important to note that you don't want to wait for alarms to go off. If you see a patient with worsening disease process, you may see peak pressures rising. You may have started your shift with a peak pressure of 23 centimeters of water, and if in a few hours that pressure's gone up to 28, 30, 32 centimeters of water pressure, it may not be enough to trigger what that ventilator alarm is set at, but it does give you insight as to what's going on in that patient's lungs. So really monitoring what the peak pressures are very important. Similarly, those peak pressures can come down as the disease state improves as well. It's important to note the PEEP again is fixed, and the same thing with the pressure support as before. You still have to monitor tidal volumes, and so this becomes important on a volume control mode, is that if you are getting the actual mandatory breaths that are assigned in the mode, that for those breaths it's important to measure the peak pressure, but for the breaths that are pressure supported breaths, it's important to note the tidal volume on those breaths. So thank you so much again for tuning in to our channel. Once again, we welcome any concerns, questions that you may have, and we're also open to taking on any additional topics that you may have as well. And as always, please subscribe to our channel. Thank you.